Sean Haney, joined by DC policy analyst for Pro Farmer, Jim Wiesemeyer. Jim, it's great to be with you here on the podcast.
Always be good on the show with you, Sean.
Absolutely. Okay, Jim, a lot of cross-border issues happening in Canada and the U.S. We're going to try to break down all of that. Some of it is isolated to each country, but I think there's a lot of carryover and a lot of examples. I got to start off by talking to you about this government shutdown. We saw Speaker McCarthy send everybody home over the weekend, probably to get home back into their local ridings to hear it from some of the locals. What's the latest on this situation?
Well, and they heard both sides of it. You know, the dilemma on the potential shutdown, which some people in this town, a growing number, say is almost unavoidable because of the major conflict between the House and Senate and White House, Sean. But the latest is that the Senate now is trying to go first on a shell bill, as we call it, with a relatively clean stopgap spending bill. We call it a CR, continuing resolution. The reason why they're altering their previous outlook on this is that if they load it up with more funding for Ukraine, which is very sensitive among some House Republicans, and funding for disaster, it's going to be controversial. So I think they're going to offer any time now a stripped down version, relatively clean. That doesn't mean it's going to be approved by the House because Kevin McCarthy, Republican from an ag district in California, he's Speaker of the House, is in a dilemma because he has around 12 what I call renegade Republicans. Other people call them rebels. I don't want to call them, they're strident conservatives, but because they don't want to give him much give at all, and they definitely don't want a clean continuing resolution. So even if it were to clear the Senate, Sean, it's going to be iffy whether or not the House can pass it without Democratic votes. Now, he has it with Democratic votes, but if that were to occur, then some of these renegades then would call for a vote on McCarthy's speakership. That's called a dilemma.
Yeah. So, Jim, we see some of the main news networks, talking a lot about shutdown. They have I remember a couple shutdowns ago, CNN even had like countdown to shutdown. We're covering the Super Bowl. That's one of the problems here, I think, is how they are covering it. What exactly happens in a shutdown situation?
Well, for USDA, almost 25%, I think, to be persnickety, 23% would be furloughed. That means the majority would still stay, but there's some, food inspection would continue, maybe delayed. The county farm service agency offices would go, so you wouldn't have the service relative to that. Crop insurance would go on because that's a contractual contract, if you will. But politically, it's you can see the White House is already pointing fingers that if a government shutdown would occur, it's a Republican shutdown. And we saw USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack was called to the White House briefing yesterday, and he went through some of the aspects of some of the WIC, Women's, Infants, and Children funding programs. So now this is in the political arena as well.
Interesting time to be a politician. And especially when you're in a leadership, you mentioned some of the pressures under, that Speaker McCarthy is facing to hold on to that position. Never mind trying to prevent a shutdown. President Biden, being president is not easy in the best of times, but in this partisan environment, I looked at 538 and his approval rating right now is 41%. Yeah. If you go back to January of 21, it was actually 54. So he has come down. According to Abacus data, Prime Minister Trudeau's approval rating right now is 29%. So
wow,
that's not good.
That is a signal even the most dense person can understand. He's in trouble. He's in trouble. I can't believe from the U.S. side, Sean, both former President Trump, who's going for the presidency again, and Biden are very low in approval ratings. Some people will say, how can Biden even be as high as 41%, with the vast majority, even Democrats, saying he really shouldn't run? But it's because of Trump. They don't want Trump to run, and if he runs, they don't want him to win. As far as Trump, he's got what I say, he has more indictments than the Washington Nationals score each game, and so you wonder why he is so high. So there's a lot of head scratching going on.
Yeah, and what we've seen in Canada here is Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who the Conservatives have really done a lot of switching around here. He's the third leader in a number of years, trying to find somebody that can beat this flagship liberal who, Mr. Teflon of Prime Minister Trudeau, who can't lose any support, and that's kind of changed here. Now, what sort of triggered it though was sort of like it wasn't necessarily voting or being more positive about Pierre. It was more about being against Trudeau and people getting tired. We have kind of a history of Canada of sort of voting people out instead of voting people in.
Yeah. Okay.
It would be kind of a bit of a refresher in politics if we had something to really kind of inspire us to vote for somebody at this point.
That's the same thing here. Until Biden and Trump are no longer possibility on the ticket, we're voting primarily against. Now, that's not a good development. I hear that. I give a lot of speeches throughout my great country, and I hear a lot of times they want to vote for somebody rather than against, but they're just not seeing it right now. And you have to ask why. Why can't these other, now it looks like 7 alternatives will be on the debate stage tomorrow in California. Now we'll see if anyone breaks away again. Nikki Haley from South Carolina looks like she's number 2 now. So DeSantis is really sinking. So I think this debate is really going to be his make or break. And as far as Canada, I would ask you, Sean, a conservative in Canada is the same definition as here?
But I would say a little bit further like a little bit more, not as right. It's a little bit more to the center, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's.
Yeah. And, I didn't say, but on our government shutdown, to be fair to those who are trying to be negative on that vote, they're talking about their over $32 trillion debt. But this is not the way to do it, is what observers say. That do it some other way. The principal role of any lawmaker, even if they're in the Senate or the House, is to fund the government. And when you shut down the government, they're striking out on their number one goal, is to fund the government. And that's the problem.
Yeah, I think, if I look at both countries, I think one of the things that's really interesting to watch what leaders do politically is trying to appeal to a broader base, like trying to, trying to bring in more people, how do they say it? Increase the size of the tent, so to speak.
Yeah, the umbrella.
Right.
The tent.
But still have to accommodate some of the base that got you to where, to the dance in the first place. We see that very much in Canada. Pierre Poilievre trying to, still appeal, deal with the right flank, where we have a further right party called the People's Party of Canada, very populist, a separate party. It's basically an off. Maxime Bernier is the leader. He was a former conservative who created his own party when he didn't beat Andrew Scheer in the conservative election numerous years ago. But he's got to kind of keep everybody together, and that's the same thing that happens in the U.S. It's very similar.
True, but it also raises the significance of the enthusiasm. And when you're in a close election, the polls to watch out for now is what party has higher enthusiasm to come to the polls. And right now, it's on the Republican side. I do want to say to your listeners and viewers, Sean, frequently when me and you are on AgriTalk, some farmers will say, well, why talk so much about the politics? That is so important because who runs a country, whether it's Canada or the United States, from a policy perspective and even economic policy, trade policy, farm policy, that makes a big difference. And that's why, because in the U.S., we've got these Trump tax cuts that are expiring. So it depends on whether or not he's reelected where that issue goes. Now, some of them will be extended, but on trade policy, but definitely foreign policy, there are some differences depending who's in the offices, White House, House, and Senate.
Absolutely. Like more so than any other industry, when you've got a whole bunch of individual entrepreneurs like we have in agriculture, those broad-based policies that would not necessarily be deemed like ag policy, they work their way back to the farm gate. And then in a reactive sense, we're like, how did this happen?
Yeah.
Right? Because we weren't proactive on the front end. Jim, I wanted to ask you about Ukraine. We've seen President Zelensky visit the U.S. He was in Canada. Got a big controversy about the visit to Canada and the fact the Speaker of the House invited somebody that had affiliations to the fighting for the Germans and the Nazi Party, which that's not going over well. We'll see if he is forced to resign. So we're not short of our own controversies here in Canada, my friend. I'm detecting, and social media is not a real place, but I'm really detecting growing, stronger, maybe louder voices around we should stop support of Ukraine and their efforts against Russia. What are your thoughts on that? What do you
You're seeing that in certain quarters in the United States as well, definitely among some Republicans. Now, it doesn't mean they want to totally exit from Ukraine. It's they want some answers on, number one, where has all this money gone, both militarily and for aid? And especially since CBS has a program every Sunday called 60 Minutes, and they focused on Ukraine and some of the money that was going for to help pay for seed and fertilizer for the Ukrainian farmers. Well, the problem that you get into, Sean, is when the economy starts going down, or the perception is that you're not doing as well, then you start looking around saying, we spent what? Over $100 billion on Ukraine. What about us? Yep. And that's where the issue is right now. And it's tied into the continuing resolution. We've got some conservative senators, even Rand Paul from Kentucky, who's saying if there's anything in Ukraine on this CR, he will vote against it. And they can't lose many votes.
Yeah, well, I keep on hearing his dad on the radio doing gold commercials about how the Fed's corrupt and you need to put your money in gold. I just laugh with those commercials.
He's consistent. He's consistent.
Well, he is. Yeah, Ron Paul is Rand Paul's dad. But Rand Paul from Kentucky, there's a lot of people that share his sentiment in regards to this topic. You mentioned 60 Minutes, and yes, $113 billion has gone to Ukraine so far for things like seeds and fertilizer, also salaries for 57,000 first responders. Is there any WTO issue with any of this? Is this like a subsidization of farming? Like
that I'd have to check into, but all sorts of issues are going to be raised. Now, a sensitive area on Ukraine here is that our lawmakers and some Biden administration officials are telling Ukraine they're giving them, they want to see a list of reforms in their government. Because, you think Russia is bad. There's no doubt about it. At least Russia's leaders, not the Russian people. But Ukraine is not the kid who sits in the front of the church. Okay.
Yeah.
They've had some bad aspects, and you see their leader in Ukraine is starting to purge some of his cabinet because of some shaky dealings, both on the military procurement end. So there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. So I think they're going to delay in the U.S. By they, I mean Congress will probably delay any big additional expenditures for Ukraine until later this year.
Yeah, isn't the amount 24 billion? Is that kind of
Yes.
what's in question?
Yeah, but I think that's even going to not surface as much. They're going to have to delay it in order to get the government funded, because enough Republicans will not vote in it in both the Senate and the House. It's that big of an issue right now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be really, really fascinating, because if you think about the brand of Ukraine, we have a lot of Ukrainians living in specifically Western Canada, like in Saskatchewan. So when this war broke out, there's a lot of people that got, and rightfully so, behind Ukraine's efforts here. I know, a lot of our listeners are of Ukrainian descent from that part of the country, but the brand of Ukraine has kind of shifted here a little bit. You think back to the Trump administration, it was Zelensky that was on that perfect phone call that Trump had made, and all the controversy around that. And now look at, and I remember, some of the talking heads, making all these comments about Ukraine and why are we having, this phone call, and think about how we thought about Ukraine then versus how we think about them now. It's really changed.
Yes, well, it's a proxy war. This is not just a war between Russia and Ukraine. The reason I say that is, if Russia were to win, now Russia's starting to make some strides over there. I don't know whether the general media has surfaced that as much as they probably should. But if Russia were to win, do you think they're going to stop? The fear is that they'll go into some NATO type country, the Baltics, and then that brings NATO into it and all the appendages of having to support the U.S. and our allies having to support a NATO country. That's why this is important. History clearly shows that when you have a person such as Putin who devastates a country, you have to stop him. If you don't, that's the difference between World War I and World War II.
Yeah, good point. Now, we saw that I want to talk to you about right to repair. This is a controversial issue, no doubt. So lawmakers in both the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate have now proposed legislation aimed at guaranteeing farmers that they have the right to repair agricultural equipment. So we've got Washington Democrat, Republican Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez introduced the Agricultural Right to Repair Act in the House last week. This very closely mirrors the bill that came from the Senate last year from John Tester, who is a Democrat senator from Montana. What about this right to repair? Is this something that has momentum politically?
It has
in the
momentum. Yeah, it has momentum. It's a populist issue. That means there's no really right or wrong response. So that gets you in the sensitive area. It's similar to the push for our pipelines in the United States, in South Dakota and in Iowa. Boy, you talk about a loaded issue there. The same thing on right to repair. And it's a controversial issue, and usually in a year such as this current year in Congress, anything controversial will usually not be called for a vote or be added as an amendment to a must-pass spending bill. Now, on the merits of the issue, I can see both sides. I mean, and you can see I'm an Apple person on the computers and the phones, and you can see Apple trying to deal with this. They've made it easier to work on an iPhone. So they're hearing the same thing from their perspective. When it gets into agriculture, it's usually the farm equipment. Mm-hmm. And John Deere's very good equipment, but it's gotten so complicated that they feel fervently that they need to be involved in any repair, because if they don't, they're vulnerable on that. But farmers are saying, now, wait a minute, sometimes we have to, this is software driven, and we have to wait sometimes days for a farm equipment manufacturer to come out. So that has caused a lot of issues, Sean.
Yeah, well, the U.S. National Farmers Union, they're welcoming this bill. They're saying it could save American farmers an estimated $4.2 billion per year in direct costs and equipment downtime. Now, I'm the most unmechanically inclined person in the world, Jim, so I could never work on equipment ever anyway. But when we're talking 4.2 billion, that's a lot of dough.
Yes, in a year in which you're going to be pressed for cash flow at the farm level, not only in the U.S. but Canada too, and not just because of input prices, it's because of prices for the commodities, and of course trade policy concerns. Because U.S. corn and soybean exports are not off to a good start, this year whatsoever.
Let's make our final stop there. Farm profitability. I think both sides, whether you're in Canada or the U.S., the margin crunch is real. A lot of concern about what happens with commodity prices. But when you talk to farmers, and I know you get out to the countryside a lot, it is about the concern about inputs. If we see the market go down or continue to trend lower, inputs are kind of holding. And if not, concern about diesel prices actually going up. So margin crunch seems to be the word of the day right now.
Absolutely. And that's the price, input squeeze. And on diesel prices, I remember we were talking on our AgriTalk program when they had gone down 40 to 50 cents. Now, this was the time. Farmers better watch one thing relative to diesel prices, and it's European weather. If they were to have a colder than normal winter, watch out. That would really make the diesel prices zoom higher than the dramatic run up we've seen recently. As far as the farm financial situation, I want to hold off on getting a pretty solid call on the price situation for another month. I want to see what USDA is going to do next month in the crop production report, if we have one, relative to any potential shutdown. Because if they were to reduce soybean yields more, you're already in a relatively tight situation, stocks to use. And so you could have a pretty good bump. I think corn has enough cushion to take a little more downturn in the yield, but I would watch that. I don't think we still have the right numbers for both, especially soybeans and corn. So I would watch that.
Well, and to diesel prices or what's happening in the energy markets, this is where people get kind of confused and kind of upset. Is, listen, Canada and the U.S. clearly have government policy that is not giving good investment signals to the energy sector. And so we're kind of stuck with the infrastructure that we have. It's impossible to build a pipeline. Who's building refineries? Nobody. And now we have demand isn't changed. Like, demand is still strong for these commodities. And we've kind of made this nest for ourselves.
Yeah, well, we have a big issue, and I know it's going to flow. I know it's flowing into Canada relative to the sustainable aviation fuel, because canola will probably qualify for that.
Absolutely.
You've seen some of that. USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack is telling the corn producers, hey, you better get going on this, on qualifying for to be an eligible fuel for the sustainable aviation fuel, which will be a airline industry carbon offset, because of the clear decrease in the number of gallons of gasoline going to be consumed in the years ahead from the renewable fuel standard and the rise of electric vehicles. So, and that's also going to be an issue for you all, because canola will fit into that category. So that's more of a longer term issue, but I'm telling you, we've got a big buildup in our soybean crushing facilities here over the last year. And you can see it in USDA's numbers on crush for soybeans. And so from a mega trend perspective, if this continues, we're going to crush for oil rather than meal. And that's a mega fundamental change if that continues. Now, that'll mean more meal for livestock producers, but it also brings up trade policy, because you're going to have a lot of meal. And the domestic consumption can only go so far, so you're going to have to export more. So that makes trade market development is going to become much more important now in the years ahead than it has been under both the Trump administration and the Biden administration.
Yeah, we've been talking lots here about what the heck we're going to do with all this meal, because we've been shipping raw canola seed to China. This whole renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel is a diversification away from China on the seed and the oil. but they are still going to be a very important market when it comes to getting rid of all this meal. We got to get something for it. We can't just dump it all in the ocean or in the landfill. It has value, but there's going to be a lot of it. It's going to change the way that some of these trade flows work, which is going to be very interesting to follow. Jim,
absolutely.
This has been awesome. Oh, I can't wait to do more of these. Thanks so much, buddy. I really, really appreciate it. Look forward to our next chat.
Anytime, Sean.